I didn't argue when they nailed the foreclosure notice to my front door. I just stood there, breathing in the sharp chemical sting of fresh adhesive, while Margaret Holloway smiled like she'd already erased me from the map. The paper crackled in the dry Texas air, bright white against the weathered cedar of a farmhouse that had outlived 3 generations. And for a moment, the only sound was the low hum of her Lexus idling at the edge of my gravel drive. 72 hours, Mr. Caldwell, she said, voice sweet enough to rot wood, heels clicking like a metronome counting down my eviction. I could taste the dust rising under my boots, feel the sun pressing against the back of my neck, and somewhere behind her, 2 HOA board members shifted like they were witnessing a routine transaction instead of a land grab dressed up as community enforcement. They thought this was clean, legal, final. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to check, was that paperwork cuts both ways. I ran my fingers along the edge of that notice, slow, deliberate, like I was memorizing the texture, and I let the silence stretch just long enough to make Margaret's smile twitch at the corners. This house wasn't just wood and nails. My grandfather built it in 1958 with a borrowed tractor and a promise he refused to break. My father kept it standing through drought years when the land cracked open like old paint. And me? I kept it exactly the same on the outside. Same chipped porch rail, same rusted mailbox leaning 2 inches too far left. Because sometimes the best place to hide power is behind something that looks like it has none. Margaret stepped closer, her perfume cutting through the scent of dry grass and motor oil, and tapped the notice like she was sealing my fate with her fingertip. You should have paid your fines, she said. I almost laughed. Fines. Violations. Late fees stacked like bricks until they could call it default. I'd seen the pattern before. Manufacture pressure, force a lien, seize the asset. Efficient, predictable, amateur. I glanced past her, down the row of identical rooftops stretching across Willow Creek estates, each one sitting quiet under the afternoon heat, each one financed, leveraged, and bundled into something far bigger than any of them realized. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a soft, precise vibration I'd been waiting for, and I didn't even check it. I didn't need to. Timing was everything. Margaret mistook my silence for surrender. People like her always do. She turned, already walking back to her car, already celebrating a victory she hadn't secured yet. And that's when I finally spoke, just loud enough to carry across the gravel and into the stillness she thought she owned. You might want to hold off on celebrating, I said, watching her pause, just slightly, her shoulders tightening beneath that tailored blazer. Because the last time I checked, I let the words hang there, measured, controlled, like a signature waiting at the bottom of a document. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of cut hay and distant asphalt, and somewhere deep in my chest, something settled into place, calm and inevitable. You don't seize a house, I said quietly, when you owe the man standing in it. Margaret stopped mid-step, just enough to betray that something in my voice did not match the script she had already written in her head. And for the first time since she rolled onto my property that morning, the air shifted, subtle but real, like the pressure drop before a storm you cannot see yet. She turned back slowly, her heels grinding into the gravel, and I could hear the faint crunch echo across the dry field behind me, each step measured, controlled, but no longer effortless. Excuse me, she said, and the sweetness in her voice had thinned, stretched too tight over something sharper underneath. I did not move from the porch. The wood beneath my boots creaked softly, the same familiar sound it had made every morning for the last 20 years, grounding, steady, unchanged. I let my gaze drift past her again, across the subdivision that had swallowed what used to be open pasture, rows of identical houses lined up like numbers in a ledger, clean, polished, financed. Always financed. That was the part people like Margaret never thought about. They saw ownership as a title deed, a name on a mailbox, a vote in an association meeting. They never followed the paper trail past the surface, never asked who actually carried the weight of those homes when the numbers moved behind the scenes. You heard me, I said, calm, even, the kind of tone that does not ask for attention but takes it anyway. A breeze rolled through the yard, carrying the dry scent of sunburned grass and distant fertilizer, brushing against the edge of the notice still hanging on my door, making it flutter just enough to remind both of us it was still there. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me, calculating now, searching for something she had missed. That was the moment the confidence cracked, not shattered, just a thin fracture running through it. "You are in default," she replied, but this time it sounded more like a statement she needed to hear herself. "The lien is valid. The board approved enforcement." I nodded once, slow, acknowledging every word like it mattered, like I respected the process she believed she controlled. "It is valid," I said, and I watched that small piece of reassurance land in her expression, watched her shoulders lift half an inch as she thought she had regained footing. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned the screen toward her without stepping closer. The sunlight caught the glass, but not enough to hide the document displayed there, a clean header, a familiar logo, and a list of account identifiers that matched every single property behind her. I did not need to explain it. People like Margaret recognized power when it was formatted correctly. Her eyes moved across the screen, fast at first, then slower, then stopping altogether as the meaning caught up to her. The color in her face did not drain all at once. It faded in layers, like something being erased line by line. The hum of her car engine suddenly sounded louder, intrusive, like it did not belong in the moment anymore. One of the board members shifted behind her, the sound of fabric brushing against itself too loud in the silence that followed. "That is a servicing document," she said, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain. I tilted the phone slightly, enough for the sunlight to illuminate the signature block at the bottom. My name sat there, printed and signed, quiet and final. "Not servicing," I said, my voice steady, almost conversational. "Ownership." The words settled between us heavier than anything she had brought onto my property. I could see the calculations starting behind her eyes now. Not about me, not about the farmhouse, but about everything else. The streets, the houses, the payments, the risk. For the first time since she stepped onto my land, Margaret Holloway was no longer looking at a problem she could manage. She was looking at a system she did not control. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass about to crack under pressure, and I could hear every small sound inside it. The ticking engine of her car, the faint rustle of paper on my door, the distant bark of a dog somewhere deeper in the subdivision. All of it suddenly louder because no one knew what to say next. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of her clipboard, the polished confidence she walked in with now replaced by something far more cautious, something that needed confirmation before it moved again. "That is not possible," she said. But her voice no longer carried authority, it carried doubt, and doubt spreads fast when it lands in the wrong place. I slid my phone back into my pocket like it was nothing more than a receipt I had already filed away, and I stepped down off the porch, one slow step at a time, boots pressing into the gravel with a steady crunch that grounded the moment. The heat pressed against my back, the sun reflecting off the windows of the houses behind her, rows of quiet investments that suddenly felt a little less stable than they had 5 minutes ago. "You built your case on paper," I said, stopping a few feet in front of her, close enough now that I could see the small details she usually hid behind confidence, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flicked past me as if searching for someone else to take control of the situation. "So did I." One of the board members cleared his throat behind her, a soft, nervous sound, and I could feel the shift happening, not just in her, but in them, in the entire structure she relied on. People who follow power are quick to notice when it changes direction. "We have legal authority," she insisted, but it sounded rehearsed now, like she was repeating a line that no longer fit the scene. I nodded again, calm, measured, letting her finish every sentence she needed to say, because the more she spoke, the more the imbalance revealed itself. "You have enforcement authority," I corrected, keeping my voice even. "On paper, within your bylaws, within your little circle." I turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward the neighborhood behind her, the identical rooftops, the manicured lawns, the quiet driveways that looked so permanent from the outside. But every one of those homes runs on something else entirely. The breeze picked up again, carrying the faint smell of hot asphalt from the main road, and I watched as one of the board members shifted his weight, his confidence draining faster now that the words were starting to connect. Margaret followed my glance, just for a second, and that was all it took. That was the crack widening. "Monthly payments," I continued, my tone still calm, almost instructional now, like I was explaining something simple that had just been overlooked. Interest rates, adjustable terms, renewal windows, all of it tied together in a portfolio that does not care about HOA rules. Her lips parted slightly, like she was about to interrupt, but nothing came out. For the first time, she was not in control of the conversation. You filed a lien on my property, I said, letting the words land one by one. Which means you triggered a review clause. I could see it now, the realization forming, slow but undeniable, like a light coming on in a room she did not know existed. And when that clause triggers, I added quietly, it does not just look at me. The wind lifted the edge of the notice again, a soft flutter against the wood, and the sound felt different now, less like a threat and more like a reminder of how small it really was. Margaret's grip on the clipboard loosened just slightly, and I knew she understood enough to be afraid, even if she did not yet understand everything. That was the thing about systems like this. You do not need to explain the entire machine. You just need to show someone where they are standing inside it, and let them realize how little control they actually have. Margaret's eyes did not leave mine this time, but I could see the shift happening behind them, the quiet recalculation, the moment where confidence stops being automatic and starts being forced, like she was holding it together out of habit rather than certainty. The clipboard in her hand lowered just a fraction, and that tiny movement said more than anything she had spoken so far. What exactly are you implying? She asked, and now there was something else in her voice, something careful, something that had not been there when she first stepped onto my land. I exhaled slowly, letting the warm air settle between us, feeling the weight of the moment stretch just enough to make every word matter. I am not implying anything, I said. I am explaining how this works. I turned slightly and walked a few steps toward the edge of the porch again, not to create distance, but to reset the space, to make her follow the conversation instead of controlling it. The gravel crunched under my boots, steady and deliberate, and I could hear one of the board members shift again, the soft scuff of his shoe betraying how uncomfortable he had become. When your HOA files a lien, I continued, glancing back over my shoulder, it flags the entire loan structure tied to that property. I tapped lightly against the wooden post of the porch, the old wood solid under my knuckles, unchanged by anything they had tried to do. And when that structure is part of a larger portfolio, it triggers a broader review. Margaret took a step forward without realizing it, drawn in by the explanation, by the need to understand something she had never had to think about before. A review of what? She asked, and now the question was real, not rhetorical. I turned back to face her fully, meeting her gaze without raising my voice, without changing my tone. Everything, I said. The words settled heavy, final, like a stamp on a document. The wind moved again, carrying the distant hum of traffic from the highway, blending with the faint ticking of her engine, and for a second, no one spoke. Then I reached into my pocket again, slower this time, not to show anything new, but to let the motion itself carry meaning. I did not even look at the screen when I unlocked it. Payment histories, I continued, calm, precise. Refinancing terms, risk exposure, compliance flags. Every house in this neighborhood is part of that chain. I lifted my eyes back to hers, including yours. That landed. I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her breath caught just slightly before she steadied it again. Behind her, one of the board members muttered something under his breath, too low to make out, but loud enough to confirm what they were all starting to realize. This was no longer about a farmhouse at the edge of their development. This was about the foundation they had built everything on without ever questioning who held it together. You cannot just, she started, but the sentence did not finish, because she did not know how to finish it anymore. I stepped forward once, closing the distance just enough to make sure she could not look past me this time, could not retreat into the safety of assumptions. You are right, I said quietly. You cannot just do that. I let a small pause settle before I added the part she was not ready for. But I can. The words were not loud, not aggressive, but they carried weight, the kind that does not need volume to be understood. The notice on my door fluttered again behind me, softer now, almost irrelevant, and I watched as Margaret Holloway finally saw it for what it really was. Not leverage, not control, just paper. Margaret did not move for a long second after I said it, like her body needed time to catch up with what her mind had just started to understand. And when she finally shifted her weight, it was slower, more deliberate, like every step now carried consequence she had not accounted for. The confidence that once filled the space around her was gone, replaced by something tighter, something controlled, like she was trying to hold together a version of reality that no longer matched what was happening in front of her. "You are overstepping," she said, but the words lacked force, like she was testing them instead of delivering them. I shook my head slightly, the motion calm, almost patient. "No," I replied. "I am responding." The distinction hung there between us, sharp and clear. Behind her, one of the board members pulled out his phone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen, probably searching for something, anything that could anchor this situation back into something familiar. I recognized that instinct. People look for rules when they feel control slipping. They hope the system will protect them, not realizing they have just triggered a different one entirely. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the gravel, and I could feel the heat radiating. Off the ground, steady and unchanging, a contrast to the tension building in the air. "You cannot just interfere with private loans," Margaret continued, her voice tightening again as she reached for authority she thought still belonged to her. "There are regulations. There are protections." I let out a quiet breath, not dismissive, just measured. "There are," I agreed. "And every one of them is written into the agreements you never read." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, like she was trying to piece together a puzzle with missing edges. I reached back toward the door behind me and, without looking, pulled the notice free from where it had been stuck. The adhesive gave with a soft tearing sound, and I held the paper up between us, the bold lettering now just ink on something that suddenly felt a lot less official. "This," I said, tapping it lightly with my finger, "is enforcement at your level." I lowered it slowly. "What I am talking about exists above that." The breeze caught the edge of the paper, making it flutter once more, and I let it fall to my side, no longer giving it the weight it had carried before. One of the board members stepped forward then, his voice uncertain but urgent. "What happens if that review you mentioned actually goes through?" he asked, and there it was, the first real question that mattered. Not about me, not about the farmhouse, about them. I looked at him, then back at Margaret, making sure she heard the answer just as clearly. "It depends," I said, my tone steady, almost matter of fact, "on what it finds." The silence that followed was heavier this time, thicker, like the air itself had slowed down. Margaret swallowed once, the movement subtle but visible, and for the first time, she did not immediately speak. That was the shift. Not when she doubted me, not when she questioned the document, but when she stopped talking altogether. Because people who are used to control only go quiet when they realize they might not have it anymore. I slipped the notice into my back pocket, the paper folding easily, like it had already lost its purpose, and I took one small step back toward the porch, reclaiming the space without force. "You wanted to make this legal," I said, meeting her eyes one. "More time. Now it is." The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. And as the wind moved through the yard again, lifting dust and carrying it across the line where their development ended and my land began, I could see it clearly now in her expression. She was no longer thinking about taking my house. She was thinking about whether she could keep her own. Margaret took a slow breath, the kind people take when they are trying to regain control of a situation that has already slipped past them, and I could see the shift settle into her posture, not confidence returning, but strategy replacing it. She straightened slightly, lifted her chin just enough to rebuild that familiar presence, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something sharper, more calculated. "Then we will resolve this properly," she said, emphasizing each word like she was placing pieces back on a board she thought she still understood. "Through legal channels." I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. People like Margaret always retreat to process when power becomes uncertain. They trust systems, especially when they believe those systems are built for them. I nodded once, slow and deliberate. "That is exactly what is happening," I replied. The words landed differently now, not as a statement, but as confirmation of something already in motion. A faint vibration rolled through my pocket again, subtle but precise, and this time I pulled the phone out without hesitation. The screen lit up in the sunlight, clean, bright, and unmistakable. I glanced at it briefly, then back at her, letting the timing speak for itself. The review has already started, I said. The reaction was immediate, even if she tried to hide it. Her eyes flicked to the phone, then back to my face, searching for exaggeration, for bluff, for anything that would make this less real. Behind her, the board members exchanged quick, uneasy glances, the kind people share when they realize they are no longer operating with full information. That is not how this works, she said quickly, but now the words came faster, less controlled. You cannot initiate something like that without notice. I tilted my head slightly, considering her, not dismissing, just measuring. I did not initiate it, I said calmly. You did. That stopped her. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the meaning to land. The wind shifted again, carrying a dry swirl of dust across the edge of the driveway, blurring the clean line between my land and theirs for just a moment. Filing the lien, I continued, my tone steady, almost instructional again, triggered an automated compliance check across the entire portfolio. I lifted the phone slightly, just enough for her to see the timestamp at the top of the screen. 7 minutes ago. The number hung there, precise, undeniable. One of the board members stepped back without realizing it, his shoe grinding into the gravel with a sharp crunch that broke the quiet. Margaret did not move. She was still now, completely still, like she was holding everything in place while her mind raced through possibilities she had never needed to consider before. What kind of compliance check? She asked finally. And this time there was no authority in the question, only urgency. I let a small pause settle, not to delay, but to make sure she understood that the answer mattered. Risk exposure, I said. Loan integrity. Payment consistency. Any irregularities that might affect the stability of the portfolio. I watched her closely as I spoke, watched the realization deepen with each word. And if something does not meet the standard, I added quietly, it gets flagged. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it, like the entire neighborhood behind her had suddenly become part of the conversation without making a sound. Margaret's lips parted slightly, but again, no words came out. Because she understood now. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that this was no longer contained. That whatever she had started here on my front porch had already moved beyond it. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, the motion slow, controlled, final. You wanted to enforce the rules, I said, meeting her eyes one more time. Now the rules are enforcing themselves. The breeze moved through again, softer this time, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant pavement. And for the first time since she arrived, Margaret Holloway did not look like she was in charge of anything at all. The first phone call came before anyone moved, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness like a crack in glass, and it did not come from me. One of the board members fumbled with his phone, eyes wide, voice low and tight as he answered, turning slightly away like distance might soften whatever he was about to hear. Hello? Yes, this is. He stopped, listening, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to alarm. I did not need to hear the other side to know what was being said. I had seen this pattern before, felt this exact moment unfold in conference rooms 100 miles away from places like this, where decisions were made quietly and consequences arrived all at once. Margaret did not look at him right away. She kept her eyes on me, like if she broke that connection, the situation would become something she could not pull back from. What is it? She asked finally, her voice controlled, but thinner now, stretched by tension she could no longer hide. The man lowered the phone slowly, his grip tightening around it like it might slip out of his hand. They are reviewing accounts, he said, each word slower than the last. They said there is a compliance flag across multiple properties. The words hung there, heavy and undeniable, and I watched as they landed in Margaret's expression, not all at once, but in stages, like pieces locking into place whether she wanted them to or not. Another phone buzzed, then another, the soft vibrations building into a quiet chorus that spread through the small group standing on my driveway. Each one carried the same message, the same realization, the same shift from certainty to uncertainty. The neighborhood behind them remained still, sunlit and quiet, but it no longer felt stable. It felt like something balanced on a structure no one had thought to examine until now. Margaret finally turned, just slightly, enough to look at the others, and in that moment, I saw it clearly. She was no longer leading. She was reacting. This is routine, she said quickly, too quickly, the words rushing out like she was trying to contain something already slipping beyond her reach. Banks do reviews all the time. It does not mean anything. But even as she said it, her eyes flicked back to me, searching, measuring, trying to find something that would contradict what was happening. I did not move. I did not interrupt. I just let the moment play out, because this part did not need help. Systems like this correct themselves once they start moving. Another call came in, this time louder, the ringtone sharp against the quiet, and the man answered with less composure than before. "No, we have never missed a payment," he said quickly, defensive now. "Everything is current." "What do you mean by restructuring review?" The phrase carried across the space between us, and I saw Margaret's shoulders stiffen again. That was the word she understood. Restructuring. Not a threat. Not yet. But a possibility. And possibilities are where control starts to disappear. I took a slow breath, the air warm and dry in my lungs, and stepped back onto the porch, reclaiming my ground without force, without urgency. The wood creaked under my boots again, steady, familiar, unchanged. "This is what happens," I said quietly, not to interrupt, but to anchor the moment, when a system checks itself. Margaret turned back to me fully now, no hesitation left, only urgency. "Stop it," she said, and for the first time, it sounded like a request instead of a command. I met her gaze, calm, steady, unshaken. "I am not doing anything," I replied. "It is already in motion." The wind moved through the yard again, lifting dust and carrying it across the boundary line. And as the phones continued to buzz, as the voices grew tighter, more uncertain, the truth settled in around us. This was no longer about taking my house. This was about whether the foundation beneath theirs could hold. The calls did not stop, they multiplied, overlapping now, voices tightening, questions stacking on top of each other as the reality spread faster than anyone could control it. And I could see it ripple through them in real time, the slow collapse of certainty turning into something sharper, something urgent. One of the board members stepped away entirely, pacing toward the edge of the driveway, his voice raised just enough to break the quiet pattern they had walked in with. "No, I need specifics," he said into the phone, frustration creeping in. "What exactly is flagged?" He paused, listening, and whatever answer came back hit him harder than anything before, because his shoulders dropped, just slightly, like something inside him had given way. Margaret stayed where she was, but her stillness was no longer controlled. It was rigid, like she was holding herself together by force alone. Her eyes moved across the group, taking in each reaction, each shift, each crack in the structure she used to command. "This is temporary," she said, louder now, projecting again, trying to rebuild authority through volume, but it did not land the same. Not anymore. The wind carried her words away before they could settle. I leaned back slightly against the porch post, the old wood solid against my shoulder, grounding, unchanged, and I let the moment breathe. Because this part was not about me speaking. It was about them hearing. Another phone rang, sharp and insistent, and this time Margaret reached for her own, her hand moving faster than before, less composed. She glanced at the screen, and I watched the shift happen again, smaller this time, but deeper. She answered quickly, turning just enough to shield her expression, but not enough to hide it completely. "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "This is Margaret Holloway." A pause. Then another. Her posture stiffened, her free hand tightening around the clipboard until the edges bent slightly under the pressure. "That is not accurate," she said, but the confidence was gone now, replaced by something closer to defense. "Our accounts are in good standing." She listened again, longer this time, and when she spoke next, her voice had changed. Not louder, not softer, just different. "A conditional review," she repeated, and the words seemed to settle heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Conditional. That was the word that mattered, because it meant nothing had been decided yet, but everything was now possible. I watched her carefully as she turned back toward me, the phone still pressed to her ear, her expression no longer controlled, no longer certain, but calculating in a different way now, trying to understand the scale of what she had triggered. Around her, the board members were no longer standing in formation. They were scattered, each one pulled into their own conversation, their own version of the same realization. The neighborhood behind them remained quiet, the same neat lines, the same clean driveways, but it felt different now, like a picture that had been hanging straight for years suddenly tilted just enough to make you notice it. What happens next? Margaret asked into the phone, but I knew she was not just asking them. She was asking the situation itself. I let the silence stretch for a second longer before answering. Not into the phone, not loudly, just enough for her to hear. That depends on what they find, I said again, steady, unchanged. She lowered the phone slowly this time, the call still active, but her attention fully on me now, and for the first time since she arrived, there was no authority left in her stance. Only consequence. The breeze moved across the yard once more, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distant pavement, and as the calls continued, as the words review, flag, and restructuring echoed through the air, the truth settled in completely. This was never about a farmhouse. It was about who actually held the weight of everything built around it, and that answer had just changed. The noise did not fade. It settled into something steadier, lower, more controlled, like the moment after a storm when everything is still moving but nothing is loud anymore. And I could see it in their faces, the shift from panic to calculation, from denial to quiet acceptance that whatever had started here was not going to reverse itself just because they wanted it to. Margaret lowered her phone completely this time, the call still active but forgotten, her attention fixed on me in a way that had nothing to do with authority anymore. It was different now, measured, careful. "What do you want?" she asked, and that question changed everything, because it was no longer about what she could take. It was about what she might be allowed to keep. I pushed myself off the porch post and stepped forward again, slow, deliberate, the gravel responding under my boots the same way it always had, steady and unchanged, a reminder that not everything shifts when pressure hits. "I did not start this," I said, my voice even, grounded. "You did." I let that settle before continuing, not to drag it out, but to make sure she understood the order of events, the cause and effect she could not undo. The breeze moved lightly across the yard, carrying the faint smell of dry soil and distant cut grass, and the neighborhood behind her sat quiet, unaware of how close it had come to something much bigger than an HOA violation. "You filed a lien on my property," I continued. "You pushed enforcement past a point where it could stay local." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she did not interrupt. "Not this time. And now," I added, "everything connected to that decision is being reviewed." One of the board members ended his call and walked back slowly, his expression no longer defensive, no longer certain, just aware. That was the difference now. Awareness. Margaret took a small breath, steadying herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was controlled, but stripped of the edge it once carried. "If the lien is withdrawn," she said carefully, "does the review stop?" There it was. Not a demand, not a threat, a negotiation. I held her gaze for a second, long enough to make sure she understood that this was not a game, not a bluff, not something that could be reversed with a simple gesture. "The system does not work like that," I replied. "Once it starts, it finishes." The words were calm, but final. I saw it land, not with panic this time, but with acceptance. The kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer in control of the outcome, only their response to it. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing past the edge of the porch, lifting a thin layer of dust that drifted across the line between my land and theirs before settling again. Margaret looked past me briefly, toward the farmhouse, toward the land she had tried to claim, and then back at me. "Then what happens to us?" she asked quietly. I did not answer right away, not because I needed time, but because the silence mattered, because sometimes the truth is clearer when it is not rushed. I let the moment breathe, the quiet stretching just enough to make the answer inevitable before I spoke it. "That depends," I said finally, my voice steady, grounded in something deeper than the situation itself, on what was built on solid ground and what was not. The words settled into the space between us, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Around us, the calls had quieted, the movement slowed, and the neighborhood stood exactly as it had before, unchanged on the surface. But underneath, something had shifted, something real, something structural. I turned slightly, stepping back toward the porch, not dismissing them, not driving them away, just reclaiming what had always been mine without needing to prove it again. The wood creaked softly under my boots, familiar, steady, and I rested my hand briefly against the post, feeling the solid grain beneath my fingers. Margaret did not speak again. She did not need to, because the outcome was no longer hers to decide. And as the breeze carried one last trace of dry earth across the yard, the truth settled in completely, quiet and undeniable. They tried to take my home, without realizing I was the one holding the paper beneath theirs.